We begin this morning with a growing backlash over a Senate bill that would slash legal immigration to the United States. President Trump endorsed the legislation yesterday. It would create a merit-based immigration system, meaning that it would favor English-speaking, highly skilled, wealthier immigrants. Supporters say the current system drives down wages for working-class Americans, but critics argue immigrants are crucial to the U.S. economy and low-wage jobs. Despite President Trump's support, the bill faces major hurdles in Congress. Here's what the president had to say about the legislation yesterday.
This legislation will not only restore our competitive edge in the 21st century, but it will restore the sacred bonds of trust between America and its citizens. This legislation demonstrates our compassion for struggling American families who deserve an immigration system that puts their needs first and that puts America first.
CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett is with me now. So, Major, we identified some of the highlights of this proposal here. The bill will give extra points if you speak English, if you are highly skilled. What else do we need to know about this?
So right now, legally in America, about 1 million immigrants enter, and there is a component of that called chain migration, which means if you receive a green card, legal permanent residence in the United States, other members of your family, not just your siblings and your spouse, but your elderly parents, your other relatives, get preference to come into the United States. This legislation would end that, limiting it only at spouses and children. There would be one provision: if you have to take care of an elderly parent, they could have a renewable temporary visa. But most of that chain migration would be ended, and that would be responsible for cutting the 1 million annual legal immigration number back to about 500,000 over the course of a decade. And as you indicated, it would prioritize high-skilled laborers who are coming for a job that pays 1.5 times the average rate in any given state. The whole idea here is to take away the idea that chain migration, meaning families, is the first and most important way you can obtain a green card or legal status in the United States, divorced from your skills, divorced from your English proficiency, and put those categories, proficiency in English, skilled labor, and or job already available at a high wage amount of salary, make those the key components to legal immigration. The problem here is that assumes that legal immigration has been driving down wages. You heard the president refer to that just a moment ago. Well, lots of things are a part of the stagnation of wages, particularly for lower middle class workers. The weakness of labor unions is one factor. Automation is another factor. The globalization of labor, meaning companies moving jobs from the United States to other countries. All of that is part of this. Legal immigration, according to the statistics, plays a marginal role in any downward pressure on low-skilled wages in this country. So it may be a politically popular idea, but it is not necessarily the economic answer to a multifaceted economic problem.
And so I imagine in Washington there are those applauding the president and those criticizing. What's the reaction been?
So Democrats almost entirely are opposed to this system because they do believe family chain migration is a way to maintain a nuclear family, number one. And number two, it's more consistent with the American approach to immigration, which is if you come here with limited skills, limited English proficiency, you bring your family with you, you can build a whole new life. That's kind of one aspect of the American dream. So Democrats are almost entirely opposed. Republicans are split on this because they argue, and Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, Tim Scott also from South Carolina, both senators have said a lot of Americans simply won't take the lower skilled, lower wage jobs in tourism and agriculture, just to name two industries, and that those vacancies, if left unfilled, will harm economic growth and development in this country. So it is a legislative long shot, to be sure. One way this idea could stay alive is if it's married with other immigration reforms and this package becomes more comprehensive. And I will tell you, here at the White House, the president toyed with that idea, putting together a whole package to deal with all the unresolved issues on immigration. But he decided not to go with this single-shot approach on legal immigration, which, if you talk to people on Capitol Hill, is the one aspect of immigration that most people think is least broken and has the most bipartisan support.
Well, you sort of answered my next question. I think a lot of people, might have been surprised to hear the president talk about legal immigration, because illegal immigration is what we heard him talk about the most on the campaign trail, and we haven't heard much talk about it since, really. So do you think maybe the president was looking for perhaps an easy win here?
Well, something that has political support, certainly among his supporters, who throughout the campaign heard this idea of America first, protecting American workers who've had a lot of downward or stagnant wage pressure for 20 or 30 years. Those American workers want answers, want remedies, and they're willing to take any number of proposed solutions. And this would certainly fall into that category. So for the Trump base of supporters, this is a very popular idea. The concept, however, of bringing comprehensive immigration reform to this question is something I said the president toyed with. But for example, foreign workers coming in on temporary worker visas work at some Trump properties. During the campaign, I asked candidate Trump, can't you find Americans for jobs at your Mar-a-Lago resort, for example? He said, no, it's absolutely impossible. Well, that's the very answer that some businesses and those members of Congress who are sensitive to their economic needs are saying in response to this. And they would say to the president, you yourself, Mr. President, at Mar-a-Lago don't practice what you are now trying to preach, this particular legislation.
Right. I feel like those words are probably going to come back to haunt him. You talked about appealing to his base. Let us talk about a new Quinnipiac poll that shows the president's approval rating plunging to a new low. I suppose that's not that new. But perhaps what is new is when you sort of break down those numbers, because some of the areas or some of the groups in which his approval rating is dropping are groups that typically have supported him in the past. What do you think is behind this? Is it the lack of getting a big piece of legislation through? Is it the what seems like confusion among his staff, the shakeup? What's going on here?
So there's been a steady erosion of those who were sort of in the initial President Trump camp, and those numbers on Inauguration Day were already historically low. So he started from a comparatively low position in terms of broad American support on Inauguration Day, and there's been a steady erosion since then. And that erosion has come from those not who consider themselves hardy and passionate Trump supporters, those who were locked in during the campaign, but those who sort of looked at candidate Trump as someone worth taking a chance on because he was outside of the political system and he was so very different. And they thought perhaps he had a better than even shot of, quote unquote, draining the swamp and bringing new methodology to Washington. The erosion is really linked to those people either giving up hope in that prospect or becoming increasingly discouraged with the president's management of the White House, and certainly the lack of progress on repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act has diminished some support among Republicans who consider that among not only the top priority, but among the easiest things for a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican president to accomplish. Why? Because candidate Trump campaigned on it consistently, and Republicans in Congress have been promising it for 7 years. That unfulfilled promise is probably the most recent reason you've seen the poll numbers drop a couple more points, because that level of discouragement with the lack of progress is what a lot of those early Trump supporters are seeing and not responding positively to.
Major Garrett at the White House, thank you so much, Major.
Sure.